Hi, Dawn. Hi, Dawn.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
You see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay, this is just a placeholder slide. I'm just going to
Okay,
welcome, and then I'm going to offer a reminder about the abstract deadline's been extended to November 30th, and
yeah,
the conference has moved to a virtual environment.
yep, great. That looks great. So you're going to make me a host?
You are now the host.
Okay, great. And yeah. Yeah, great. Okay. I think the speakers want to do the 3 talks first and then have the breakout room. So the order is just changed a little bit, but that's fine. It's a minor thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I think, do you want me to say welcome first and then I'll hand it over to you?
I'm going to.
Still a few more coming on, but.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. This is just a very brief introduction. An Oarsi workshop, tips for talking to the media and disseminating your research. I'll be turning it over to our moderator, Associate Professor Dawn Aiken from the University of Tasmania in just a moment. I just wanted to offer a quick reminder. We do have an abstract deadline coming up on November 30th, and the World Congress in April of 21 is going to be held virtually this year. So we're not going to be convening in Denver as planned, but we will be holding a full meeting in April, and that will be replete with posters and exhibitors and everything you've come to know and love about the Oarsi meeting, but delivered online. So it should be hopefully more accessible to people and give us a better opportunity to connect in this environment. That said, please allow me to introduce Dawn Aiken from the University of Tasmania. Dawn, I'm going to let you take it away, and I'm going to sign off, so to speak.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Dan. Yeah, I'd just like to thank Dan for all his help organizing this virtual workshop and Oarsi's support. So welcome everybody to the first Oarsi Young Investigator workshop. This is a workshop that we planned for the Oarsi Congress this year, which obviously didn't go ahead. So I'm excited that we can still deliver this workshop, and we have 3 excellent speakers today, which I'll introduce to you. Before we get started, I thought I just might cover some Zoom etiquette. So everybody, please make sure your microphone is on mute while we have our talks. And because we have a large number of participants joining, it would be best to put your video off while people are giving their talks. And when we move to question time in our breakout rooms, you can turn your video and microphone back on. So during our breakout rooms and question time, you can ask questions by raising your hand in the video, or you can use the chat function on Zoom to ask a question, or raise your hand by clicking on participants and then raise your hand, I think. Yeah. So we'll make a start. As I said, as Dan said, my name is Dawn Aitken, and I'm co-chair of the Oarsi Young Investigator Committee. And today's workshop is tips for talking to the media and disseminating your research. So our first speaker today is Dr. Christian Barton. Christian is a physiotherapist qualified senior postdoctoral researcher at La Trobe University and the University of Melbourne. A major part of his role is leading GLAD Australia, which aims to improve access to appropriate exercise and education to all Australians with osteoarthritis. Christian has a master's in communication, journalism innovation, and is currently the deputy editor for social media at the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Christian recently published an article, which I found very interesting. It's called Time to Replace Publish or Perish with Get Visible or Vanish. And I'm sure he's going to take us through some of this today. So thank you, Christian, for joining us, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Dawn. Thanks for organising today, and thanks, Dan, for your technical support with the session as well. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other presenters too. And thanks everyone for joining in to, I think, discuss what is a very important topic. As Dawn mentioned, I will talk about a paper that we titled, "Is it time to replace publish or perish with Get Visible or Vanish?" But I'll talk about a few other things as well, and some things I've learned along the way in the past few years around digital and social media. A couple of disclosures: I do teach some courses relating to knee and running injury management. I am part of not-for-profit initiatives, including GLAD Australia and Trek, which I'll talk about briefly, and there'll be some links and work with the BJSM. The other disclaimer is I was dragged kicking and screaming to social media, and I think that's important to acknowledge. This is not something I was naturally drawn to. My wife was the person who set up my Facebook account, but I've certainly embraced it as I've gone along with some of my research and knowledge translation initiatives. So what I want to go through this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever we are in the world, is why did I get pulled to this area? A bit of context, briefly touch on the looming cliff for academic journals, and I don't claim to have the answers to solve this problem, but just hopefully provoke some thoughts. Talk about how we need to and can embrace digital and social media as researchers. And then also, can we actually use digital and social media to facilitate some research impact? And by research impact, I mean, can we actually improve the reach of our own work to other researchers and actually get our papers cited a little more, which I think some of you might find interesting with some of the work I've done recently. So I guess a bit of context, my background, I started off at a gait laboratory researching patellofemoral pain, looking at foot orthoses and trying to understand mechanisms of how they might work for people with kneecap pain. And then sort of moved a little bit more into broader areas of management of patellofemoral pain. And in my early stage of postdoc, I was quite overwhelmed with how much research, not just published more broadly, there's a paper published every couple of minutes that we need to keep up with, but even in patellofemoral pain. And so decided to try and put together a practice guide. I'm still a clinician and I still treat patients, and I think it's really important we have resources for clinicians. So I thought there was this great idea to incorporate not just the research evidence that's emerging in patellofemoral pain, but also involve experts and create a treatment guide to try and disseminate the information. So broadly, if we think about osteoarthritis, patellofemoral pain is probably on a continuum with patellofemoral osteoarthritis, and the treatments are very similar in terms of what's recommended. So a tailored multimodal intervention, hip and knee exercises, consideration to patellotaping and foot orthoses, and an emphasis on education and activity modification. Although I should highlight in patellofemoral pain, there's not a great deal of evidence to support patient education, but it's certainly something that's strongly advocated. And so we used this to create a best practice guide, and my thought was, let's make this paper open access and try and disseminate it to the clinician community. We did some research on, I guess, the reach of it, and I did multiple surveys at conferences and workshops and different things, and it turns out that probably about 1 in 20 clinicians who predominantly physiotherapists treat patellofemoral pain consistently were actually reading this paper, so it wasn't reaching a great deal of people. I want to put on a video, and I'm hoping this works. If it's really choppy, Dawn, just put your microphone back on and say, Christian, turn the video off, but hopefully it'll work for a minute or so.
Seeing people in the position I was years ago, and it's like, you just want to shake them and go, that's fucking wrong. Don't do it. Surgery can do so much damage.
Sure, yeah, I've done lots of operations that I now know to be ineffective.
Do you continue to do any of them?
No, I don't continue to do any of them. Having said that, many of the operations that I'm doing now may later be shown to be ineffective.
At 18 I had a lateral release. A month later I had it cleaned out. About 18 months further on I had my first arthroscopy. About 18 months later again, another arthroscopy. Another 18 months later, another arthroscopy. I had a patellofemoral replacement. By the time I was at 31 I'd had 11 knee surgeries.
Is that working okay,
Doc? I started when I was about 13. I remember...
It's a little choppy, but it's not too bad.
Junior football, trying to kick a goal during a game, and
Before his first surgery at 18, Reese tried physio to treat his constantly dislocating kneecap and the osteoarthritis that it led to, but they couldn't help him.
The experts were telling me surgery was the way to fix it, and this was the best way to do it. My first surgery had a massive impact on me and everything I did at the time. I lost 15 kilos in about 4 weeks. I had to quit my job, I had to quit sport. Everything that I'd done on a day-to-day prior to surgery, I could no longer do anymore.
So Reese's story is not uncommon in patients that I see as a physio. And as a physio, it strikes me that we're not always very good at implementing evidence-based practice. And talking to Reece further about the type of physio he'd received, it was lots of passive treatment, so lots of dry needling and things like interferential and ultrasound, and lots of nocebic education about avoiding exercise and being careful, etc. Things that we know are not consistent with secondary prevention of osteoarthritis or even management of osteoarthritis, which is a 31-year-old Reece now had, and he ended up with a patella replacement, so quite a significant surgery. And I always sit there with cases like this, and I've always reflected of how can we do better to get quality information out. And I want to highlight that we need to think about this from a bigger picture. So I'm going to talk about digital and social media and thinking about online dissemination, but we need to think about an individual like Reece being influenced not only by that side of things, but also his social network and things that his family and friends will tell him, his organisation, his environment around him. So what's his access to actually do exercise, etc., cultural values and community, and a whole range of other factors. And then, of course, public policy. So is there actually funding mechanisms for Reece to access what we consider as high value care? So when I talk about what I'm going through today, it's really just a small piece of the puzzle in terms of trying to facilitate knowledge translation. So some more context, some qualitative work, and I could put up probably another 20 papers that give us similar messages to this. So in recent work that we've done talking to people who are got knee osteoarthritis and hip osteoarthritis, is they've been told by other health professionals that they need to potentially just think about surgery, and they're not necessarily being pushed towards what is first line care. And we know that most people around the world don't get access to quality first line care. So we've got that happening. And then there's also other logistical things for patients to access, things like exercise therapy, which we try and promote for people, which is parking at hospitals to try and get there. They're told things that maybe conflict whether exercise would help. And then, of course, there's the cost side of things. And then we have marketing of other interventions. So we need to think really carefully about us as researchers. There's pharmaceutical companies out there who make a ton of money marketing products that have arguably, I guess, not great evidence to support them and are very much experimental. And I'll use stem cells as an example, because if you look at clinical practice guidelines and think about it logically, these really still belong in clinical trials, not in mainstream health practice, but they're really poorly regulated in many parts of the world. And I think they become a really quick fix idea for people, despite the fact that we don't know that they're safe and we don't know what their potential benefits are. And so people have really been flooded with information about things like stem cells on media, but not flooded with information about the benefits of physical activity, exercise, diet, etc., and lifestyle. So then you turn to the journal model and say, well, where does the journal model fit with all of this, and what happens with the journal model? So what do we do in research? We complete a research project or a systematic review. It's a ton of work. We all know that. We write a manuscript. We have to get it through our collaborators and make sure they're happy with it. We also have to then submit it to the journal and go through sometimes a peer review process that can be biased and can be quite challenging. We have to address concerns. And then finally, we sign over copyright and put it behind a paywall. And unless we have an academic institution affiliation, we can't access the paper either, or we pay an exorbitant amount of money to make it open access for arguably not that many people to read it, and certainly not patients like Reece to reach and receive that information. So this is a model that's 350 years old. So as we sort of go through this, well, where will someone like Reece turn for information? He won't read an academic journal, he'll go online, and we've done some evaluation of this in patellofemoral pain, and we're doing some similar work in knee osteoarthritis at the moment. And what we can see for patellofemoral pain is that if we look at the information about what are evidence-based treatments, then 20% or less of websites out there have accurate and clearly described information about treatments that work. We have most, or nearly 1 in 2, that are actually designed, or websites designed to promote products and services which are arguably not of high value or evidence-based. And actually, for a condition like patellofemoral pain, surgery is not something that is recommended for many people, if any at all. Yet 22% of websites that we identified on Google and Bing were promoting surgery as almost the first-line care for these patients. So we have this information online that's perhaps misleading and misinformation. And then the other concept I want to talk to you about is, well, who's out there disseminating information and who's having influence on reaching consumers? And I'd bring this up just as a bit of a funny tongue-in-cheek joke for you to think about, but the Kardashian index is something that I've had a laugh about. And that is, we have a lot of people out there with strong influence. So Kim Kardashian is one of them. She has around 60 million followers on Twitter, and therefore anything she says on Twitter related to health or related to politics, which is something she'll often discuss on her social media accounts, is going to reach a lot of people. And in fact, a lot of people will start to believe them. We could go on about Donald Trump. We could go on about a lot of different people who have strong influence. And so Neil Hall wrote this really nice editorial for us to think about as researchers. And if you have a high Kardashian index, that is researchers who basically have not got a lot of scientific background, they may not understand the research evidence, and they may be promoting products, etc. And there's lots of examples all around the world of this. They've built on shaky foundations. They would be called a science Kardashian. But equally, I think the really important thing for us to think about as researchers, most of the people that I really highly respect, if we do a Kardashian index, which is the number of Twitter followers they have divided by the number of citations they have, then actually they've got a low Kardashian index, and their science may actually be being undervalued because it's not reaching enough people. And it's actually these other people with more prominence on social media that are influencing what people do in our society. So just an interesting thought to think about. And if you want a bit of fun, you can calculate your own Kardashian index. Mine got inflated up to around 12, and then it's dropped back to about 7 at the moment. So I'm happy I'm bringing it back down. Neil Hall promotes that anything above 5, you need to get off Twitter and start doing some research. I would say anything below 1, and you probably need to think about how you might jump on social media and disseminate some of your work. So we wrote a paper about these problems. So Mark Merrily and I, and this comes from some of my communications master's work and thinking about it. And we talked about the barriers to reaching health professionals and to consumers, that we can't access articles. Health professionals have difficulty in comprehending articles. They're not very engaging. It takes too long to read. And we promoted this idea of using digital and social media to improve the landscape. This was the response from one of the journal editors that I sent it to. So I'll read it out to you. I enjoyed reading your article, although reading the abstract as a journal editor, I couldn't help thinking that I would be keen to publish it would be like the turkey voting for a hot Christmas dinner. So in other words, why would a journal publish this when it's trying to tear down the journal model, which is very profitable? So we think about the journal model, and it actually is a $35 billion plus industry. So point being, we spend a lot of money on this, and it's really not very effective at dissemination. It does provide some really important aspects, which is things like peer review, but I think we need to really think carefully about how we're actually disseminating our information. So within the paper, and I encourage you to have a read of it beyond today, is we discuss some opportunities where we could use social media to improve access to people, embrace different types of written format. So actually don't just write your paper, but write in a blog format, write for things like The Conversation, various other platforms that would reach more people. Think about podcasts, think about visually engaging summaries. So most people are now very familiar with infographics, and most people enjoy seeing them. And also think about video dissemination. So don't just have this passive written text that is often quite dense and difficult to understand, but think about other ways you can disseminate your work, because if you don't, other people will disseminate your work, and they might use it to sell a product or sell a course or sell something that maybe isn't aligned with what your research and what your evidence is saying or suggesting. So we've sort of got this model, and then I think the 5th step, which was probably missed in what we wrote in the paper, is not just creating multimedia beyond the first couple of steps and disseminating, but then also measuring the impact. And I think that's important. So if we're going to do anything in research, we need to measure the impact of what we do. I want to, at this point, before I move on to a couple of examples, acknowledge the conflict we face as researchers to actually spend time on this. We get judged primarily on grants and publications, and to get grants we need publications. And so this is my track record on Scopus, and you'll see in 2017 my research career is falling off an academic cliff, and I published 2 papers in that year and had some good conversations with mentors. This is when I was writing the paper like Get Visible or Vanish, and thinking about all these ideas and planning them. And I was told I need to sit down and actually start writing up some of the research I've done and think about papers. And so managed to do that over the last couple of years, but then it's probably taken away from the ability to do as much knowledge translation. So it's a challenging thing that we face, and I don't have the entire solution to it, but it's something to consider for us all. Applying this as a model, we think about it as a communications plan. So it's not just jumping on Twitter and disseminating your work. You need to think about digital assets that you would actually use to do that. So we published a clinical practice guideline for patellofemoral pain recently. We produced some infographics for it. We produced some podcasts. We put out some media releases to try and get the information out there to the community. And we managed to get an altmetrics of around 779. So for reference, in sports science, the median altmetrics of a paper in the top 20 journals is around 8. So it's quite a good reach. And just some context, 902 different tweeters actually put that out, and we reached 20 news outlets. So we were able to reach quite a range of people on a paper related to kneecap pain. But more impressively, Andrew Murray, who's one of the editors at BJSM and the editor for infographics, which we set up in the last couple of years, decided to take this model and apply it to a paper that he wrote on golf and the importance of golf. So broadly, the summary of this scoping review was that golf can provide moderate intensity physical activity, and it's associated with physical health benefits. So it's interesting, and it's an important output for people, and especially people who like golf. But what he did is he went really comprehensive, and he created videos, he created podcasts, he created the infographic series, and the infographic series had targets towards golfers and the community, had targeted towards the industry, and also targeted politicians. He wanted this to be discussed in politics so that people would actually plan to build more golf courses and support golf as a way of getting your community physically active. Building on that, had a communications plan where he actually engaged lots of people on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, blogs, emailed key stakeholders, had press releases, had direct communication with relevant stakeholders, and managed to get an altmetrics on a paper related to golf to 1,411. And I think really importantly, he actually had this reach policy and also discussed at UK Parliament by applying this as a model. So I think it's just an example of thinking a little bit beyond the original research paper rather than just publishing and moving on to the next thing. So a question we've asked more recently, and I have to thank Danilo de Oliveira Silva, who's a postdoc working with us at the moment, he's done a ton of work on this, is we looked at, well, does our altmetric score and reaching social media, does it actually improve how much our work is cited? So I think it's an interesting question. So we took 4,000 or a bit over 4,000 articles from 2017, and we had a look to see, well, if we look at the impact factor of the journal, if we look at open access status of the paper, and we look at altmetric score, how do those things rate to citations in the next couple of years? And interestingly, we found that altmetric score had the strongest relationship of all of those things when we ran some logistic regressions on it. And so what we found is that altmetric score had explained around 32% of the variance of how much your article might be cited later. So it's not a cause and effect thing, but there's certainly a strong relationship. Impact factor of the journal itself had some relationship, and the open access status, to our surprise, didn't actually have a very strong relationship. So the question that we kind of pose is, are you better to spend your $3,000 or $4,000 on making your article open access, or could that money be tailored and put towards maybe a communications plan to get your information to non-academics and non-researchers? And I guess it ultimately and then that would also then reach researchers, obviously, because they're going to look at your infographic, look at your podcast, listen to your podcast, look at your videos, etc. We're also interested in, well, which aspects of altmetrics were driving this the most, and it seems that academics probably turned to Twitter. So tweets were the primary thing that were related to the number of times the work got cited, but Facebook a little bit, news outlets and blog posts a little bit. So that was interesting as well. So just to finalise, because I know we don't have lots of time, and we can obviously talk about some of this in the workshop groups and discussions and questions, but we've thought about how we can create controlled media at La Trobe, which is where I work, and we've set up a blog. And I think the really key thing for me here is by having that blog and setting up our own controlled media, being able to reach a large number of people with patellofemoral pain. So you'll see this 5 tips page has reached over 200,000 people. But not only was it able to do that, we're able to promote Reese's story on the blog, which you saw before, and that was back in 2016. That story was picked up by a media outlet in Australia here, SBS, and they actually put Reese's story onto not only a blog, but also onto national TV and reached quite a few 100,000 people with his story. And the good news about his story is, following good quality education and exercise, he was able to get his quality of life back. And this is him walking the Inca Trail after not being able to walk down a flight of stairs. For me as a researcher, going through that process and getting this information out there also led me to getting an invitation to contribute to the same show and get out there and talk about osteoarthritis and the importance of education and exercise for that, reaching, I think, a little over 1 million people from that show on that night. So that was I'm quite pleased about that. Again, not naturally drawn to media, but it was something that I've sort of force myself to go along to and try and facilitate to get my research out there. So my take homes before I pass it on is, as researchers, we're inherently poor at communicating research. We can write papers, but beyond that, most of us are inherently poor. And I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves. The reason is we really do lack incentives. And so I guess part of why I talk about this is a call to action for everyone to think about how we can change the environment in which we work in. And we need some of this stuff to be part of the metrics in which we're judged upon. And it's starting to happen a little bit, which is nice to see. We all need to embrace digital innovation. Now, I can't stress enough, that doesn't mean you have to go out and make an infographic or a podcast or get on Twitter and do all the disseminating, but you probably need to have people as part of your research team to do that. And that's certainly something I've found effective. You saw my track record with publications in Scopus earlier. Managed to still have strong reach with social media, not by doing more on social media, but by doing less and working with others who can help me with that cause. And I think that's an important consideration as well. Multimedia and online resources are really powerful, and you can improve health outcomes with them. We've done some research recently, which I won't go through in detail today, but we have some websites we've set up for consumers, which have been really helpful to disseminate quality science information. And I think just to highlight and I guess round off that knowledge translation is not simple. So this is just one small aspect that we need to think about, but I think it's a really important and often overlooked aspect. And before I throw it to the next speaker and or questions, just want to highlight there's a couple of websites we've set up for people with patellofemoral pain. So My Kneecap is a site that we've used. It's now open access and we've tested in a recent clinical trial that's been published. And we also have a site on the same topic for clinicians. So these are open access, and I'll put all these slides up, probably share them on Twitter. So I'll put them up so that you guys can download them, have a look at them all later, and that's fine. So I'll open up to questions or passing over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christian. That was really interesting. Does anybody have any questions? I'll just check the chat box here. Someone's put up the link for calculating their Kardashian index. So thanks for that. That's good.
Yep.
So yeah, if anybody has a question, you can add it to the chat box or unmute yourself and do it that way. I was just wondering, Christian, are those people who are just getting started? Because there's, you know, so many options for us to do, as you say, infographics, podcasts, you know, Twitter. There's lots of different levels that you can engage in. Where would you suggest that someone who's just starting out, what would be best for them to do?
Yeah, I think one of the most simple things that I've seen PhD students do in the last couple of years, which I think is really powerful, is as you write your thesis and as you write your papers, if you can spend a little bit of time to maybe make an infographic summary of your thesis or an infographic summary of each of your papers, I think that's a really nice way of getting your research out there and then sharing that infographic on your own social media channels. But don't be shy to then contact esteemed researchers in that space or people with a lot of influence and following and ask them to share the same things. And that'll do a couple of things. It'll get your research out there. And that's important because when you write your fellowship applications, postdoc, then you want to have papers that have been highly cited and have strong reach, and having strong alt metrics is really important. So I think bang for buck, that's probably the easiest to do. And then I think beyond that is if you feel comfortable, then certainly putting your hand up for doing things like podcasts and talking about your research and just trying to create a network of people that can help you, because lots of people have strong reach on social media and you might not have that. So it's really about trying to build a network, and don't be shy to put your hand up to do a podcast with someone who has 20,000 followers or 30,000 followers to try and get your information out there.
Yeah. Great. So we have some questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
I think.
So I'll take.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got one here. How can researchers balance the scientific results with marketing of the industry? For example, the golf industry. It's a really, really good question. I think the ultimate key is if you can control the knowledge translation resources, then you can actually have an influence over how that is marketed. There was a really nice paper published by Mary O'Keefe about the low back pain series in The Lancet just recently. And they looked at what happened with media dissemination of that series. And there was a lot of misinformation about that low back pain series in the media put out by industry, so professional societies and various other people trying to promote what they do. But the Low Back Pain Series group didn't create their own digital assets to disseminate what they put together. And so that's probably a really good reflecting point. So the best way that you can balance it is to try and actually create the stuff yourself, or at least help others create the stuff. So that's probably my recommendation on that. Any tips on what types of people to include in a research stream to facilitate this transport? So qualification, external consults. It's going to depend a lot on budgeting. So if you have no budget, you need to work with clever and passionate and energetic PhD students and early career postdocs, and that's really effective. And try and create research projects around it as well. And we've certainly done that, and you've seen a couple of examples, and you'll go through the slides and I'll send some papers related to that as well. If you've got some funding and you've only got a little bit of funding, then certainly getting some external consultants to do things like make your infographics. So I'd consider $3,000 for open access. This is just hypothetical. I'd love to test this in an RCT, but would you be better to spend that and pay someone to make some infographics for your work and disseminate it that way? So that could be a consideration. If you've got the funding to have a communications expert in your research team, so someone who does this and builds communications plans for a living, and can facilitate that side of things, then that might be something you consider paying them to do. And we've certainly done that a bit at La Trobe, and hopefully most of you come across La Trobe Sport and Exercise Medicine. That hasn't happened by accident in terms of our reach. It's really come from some thought around how we can get some reach and get some impact of some of our research, or get it out there. But we've done it on a very low budget of maybe paying people half a day a week, or getting a journalism intern to come and join us for 6 months and doing a whole range of activities like that.
Yeah, great.
So
I think
I'm happy to take more questions later, but just thinking about time, we probably should move on to the next presenter.
Yeah, that sounds good. So yeah, Christian, if you just want to unshare your screen, and yeah, we'll move on to Professor Tahina Nuiji. And also, Tahina, we're going to have the 3 talks, and for everyone's interest, we're going to have the 3 talks in a row, and then we'll do our breakout sessions after we've had the 3 talks. So our second speaker today is Professor Tahina Nuiji. She is a rheumatologist and epidemiologist at Boston University. Her research focuses primarily on risk factors for knee osteoarthritis and gout, pain mechanisms in knee osteoarthritis, as well as methodological issues that are relevant for rheumatic disease research. She's passionate about mentoring early career researchers, as she's doing today, and she's an excellent person to follow on Twitter. She has a very interesting and active Twitter account. So welcome, Tahina, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks, Dawn, for the invitation. So I'm going to first start with my disclosure that I'm by no means an expert, and so I was actually kind of surprised by this invitation. But I will start with my first foray into sort of harnessing the internet, not necessarily for dissemination of research, but actually for recruitment and data collection. And so, other than osteoarthritis, my other area of research is in gout, and I had for many, many years worked on an internet-based study of gout, where we literally recruited people from Google. Anyone who searched for gout, and our study would come up. Eventually, our study came up as the first search result, and then we had a whole internet-based platform, web-based platform for data collection. So with this platform, we were able to really be pioneers in rheumatology for trying this out. And just to show you, what the yield was. So, our ad was displayed over 6 million times, clicked on just over 100,000 times. So you see the drop off already. And then of those, you continue to have these drop offs in terms of screening, eligibility, enrolled, subjects that actually provided data. And then this was a particular study design where we had to have people provide us information when they were having a gout flare and when they were not having a gout flare. So at the time I did this data cut, there were 371 that provided full data. So we had a cost at this point of $122 per subject. And so as many of you who may be experienced in subject recruitment, how costly it can be and how time consuming it can be. And so this was one of the first studies in rheumatology that used this methodology. but now sort of, oh, sorry, and then just to show you the reach, so I'm in Boston, but with this internet-based approach, we were able to recruit participants from all over the US, and this was just a study focused on the US. But why we're here today is, well, at least what I was asked to speak about was social media to extend your research reach and dissemination. So I'll just first say that I'm by no means an expert, and I think a lot of what Christian shared is really helpful and useful. And so I'm just going to share my few thoughts, not anywhere in the same type of depth and experience that Christian has. So I think we can start with very simple first steps in making your research accessible. So I always prefer figures over tables. I think so when you're writing a paper, when you're putting a poster together, when you're putting slides together for a talk, I'd much rather see figures and have the figures speak for themselves, or you guide your audience through the figures than dense tables. And the figures are much more social media friendly. Try working on a visual abstract, which Christian mentioned. And many of the journals nowadays have their own in-house folks that will put together a visual abstract for you. So this is a recent one for colchicine in coronary artery disease. And so you can imagine that this would be in text or in tables, but this just really very, in a succinct fashion, provides you all the information, all the essential information. And so as Christian said, you know, you may not be the one to have the skills yourself to do this, but you might be able to engage other people in your team. And so over the past year, I have someone who is a data analyst who's also kind of good about this kind of thing. And I've sent her for training for data visualization and exactly this type of stuff so that we can move into doing more of this. In addition, your institution may have a media office where they can do this kind of thing for you. And then I think, you know, for many of us, a challenge that we have is expressing the importance of the research to a broader audience. So I think it's really important to try to distill your message and think about an elevator speech. And so, you know, think about how would you describe your study to a relative who is not in science at all? Or the way I like to think about it is the New York Times. So if a New York Times reporter wants you to have just a soundbite, you know, one quote that they're going to put in their article about your paper, what are you going to say about it that's accessible and brings home the importance of your study? So getting it out there. It seems that academics, and Christian already reviewed this, it seems that academics tend to prefer Twitter. I think also LinkedIn is quite popular based on the number of invitations that I get. I'm too busy to be on too many different platforms, so I chose Twitter, and I'm only very new to Twitter. So I resisted it for a very long time because I'm just very, very busy. So I see these people who are on it constantly, and I really appreciated learning about the Kardashian Index because just for me as a casual observer, it certainly does seem that some people whose science isn't as great as some others have a lot more attention on a platform like Twitter than someone who's, you know, science I really, really respect. And so, you know, I think it's hard to find that balance. So in terms of what my approach has been is, I have a personal account, and I've tried to keep it very research oriented, but I do share some personal things. But this is not like, for me, this is not something that I'm sharing with my friends or in family. So I do try to keep it kind of academic. And then we have a departmental account, that I haven't really gotten a good sense of how to leverage that account, but I do have another colleague who's on this Zoom meeting today who's helping out with that as well. I think another thing that's helpful for busy people is thinking about scheduling your posts so that you don't necessarily miss the day that your paper is coming out and you sort of forget to post about it at the time that there would be most buzz about it. And so there are a number of different means to help you figure out your schedule for those types of posts. I think one place that people could leverage more is using your institution's media office and preparing press releases. So I've been pretty bad about this, not sort of keeping track, but I do try to make an effort that anytime I get an acceptance, I let the media office know. Then we work on a layperson's press release text, and so it's ready to go the moment that the paper is officially published. And so that's been quite helpful in getting the information out there. I think another thing that people often are reluctant to do is to respond to media requests. And there are data to show that women, female faculty in particular, are more reluctant to respond to media requests. I think this, part of the issue is that sometimes people think that I'm not the expert in this area, that there must be other people who know this area better than me. I may not be able to provide all the information. And so I think, if you're being asked, it's probably because you are recognized as an expert, and you can prepare for those interactions with the media, whether it's print, radio, or TV. And you can have do-overs, and I always make sure that I have an opportunity to review something before it goes to print. Sometimes I do have an opportunity to hear a clip before it goes live, although that's not always possible. And you also should find out about your institutional policies, because some institutions may need to vet the request, particularly if there's if it's a controversial topic. And then Christian also mentioned podcasts, and so I think it's a really easy way to get information about your research out there by participating in podcasts. And then Christian also mentioned altmetrics, and I did see that he was going to address this, but I wanted to show just an example of how getting on top of social media can help this metric. So as many of you know, I am involved in treatment guidelines, and this year we had 2 major treatment guidelines published, one in osteoarthritis and one in gout. And so for the one in gout, these are the altmetric scores here. So they're okay for rheumatology, but given the importance of treatment guidelines, this is not as good as it should be. And I honestly kind of forgot about this and sort of didn't proactively do anything about it. And the first author didn't do too much about it, but the ACR did. In contrast, there's this very small little paper that was published by a medical resident, and we did the press release, we did some tweeting about it, and this just came, was published officially in October. This was published in June, and this small little paper has a higher altmetrics at the time that I took this snapshot. So just highlighting that without that much effort, you can extend your reach. And then I think we're entering a new era of updating your CV and media mentions. So I've always had a section in my CV for newspaper, like when the New York Times interviews me. I don't put every newspaper, but New York Times is something that I would put there. If you've been on television, radio, like some NPR interviews, or sorry, I'm using very US centric, but important radio shows, podcasts. And then the other thing that I do is in our CVs, in our formal institutional CVs, sorry for the background noise, I'm having to share space right now. So it's not the birds that Christian had in his background. So I annotate important publications showing the impact they've had by being picked up by important media, or the altmetrics or the citation. So I always indicate high citation number, but now I'm also adding altmetrics and media mentions. At our institution and on our section website, we have kind of an in the news section, and So anytime something is mentioned in a blog, in a Medscape, Helio, et cetera, those types of things, we put it there. And this has also helped attract trainees in trying to understand what we're doing as part of our group. And I think one of the important things that trainees and junior faculty should do, early stage investigators should do, is anytime something good happens to you, inform your leadership. Often there are departmental newsletters, emails, or the media office might put together a press release if you received an award. So even if you may not know where to disseminate it to, leadership in the media office may have some good ideas. And then many institutions have profiles of faculty. And so in addition to your publications and your grants, there are many different sections that might be on the profiles. And if your institution doesn't do this already, you can try to advocate that they automatically pull in media mentions into your profile, and provide them with your Twitter handle so that they can also promote that on your profile. So Dawn had also asked sort of for me to summarize the positives and the negatives. So, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think that it's mainly good. It's mostly positive, and the positive experiences have been most common for me. It's nice getting your work recognized and having it disseminated. And apart from social media, when it's a journalist reaching out, I find that for the most part, not for the most part, every journalist wants to do a good job. And it's our job to make sure that we're very clear, and that we are not too technical, we're not too jargony, really distill the message in very clear, simple terms so that it doesn't get misconstrued. So the somewhat negative is not common, but for me, one of the issues is time. Sometimes there's just such a tight timeline, like a journalist will email me in the afternoon and need something within the next 2 hours, and I'm just in meetings or in clinic. So sometimes it's that time pressure that is challenging for me. And not so common for me has been incorrect info, simply because I'm usually pretty aggressive about wanting to try to review what's being put together. It's obviously easier when it's print or online. And even when it's online, if I see an error, I ask them to correct it right away. And the ugly is very rare. Sometimes you'll have rude or non-constructive comments, like some, armchair experts who, in this era, just, someone can just Google something and think they're an expert. So I just ignore those. But I do have a few people who, over the years, like there's this one guy who sends me emails periodically over the past 10 years because he has this pet theory that he wants me to research. And I tried to be polite to him initially, and that was not a good idea because I had engaged him. So I just ignore him now. So I overall have not had any really negative experiences. But again, I keep my Twitter feed very focused on academic stuff and not too political, although sometimes I can't help it. But I think the people who might have more challenges are ones that might take on a sort of a broader spectrum of topics in what they're addressing. So I didn't want to spend too much time because I wanted to have time for discussion. But I do want to acknowledge all the funding that supports my time and keeps me too busy to stay on Twitter a lot, and the team that I have the pleasure of working with every day. So I'm happy to spend whatever remaining time I might have in taking some questions.
Great, thanks very much, Tahina. I think we do have some time for some questions, and then we have some in the chat as well. So there's a question from Jean to say, are there any tips on how to choose a media request of which ones to accept? Which I think you covered a little bit there, that you try to stay focused, but if there's anything else you want to add to that, and any tips for recording podcasts?
So for the first one, I would say that I tend to accept ones that are well known. And then even if I don't pretend to know all of what's out there, so I do look them up to make sure that they're legitimate. So I personally haven't recorded podcasts. I only participate in ones that other people do. So I can't speak to your planning and recording of podcasts. And when participating, you just want to make sure you're not sitting in a room with someone else that you're sharing the space with right now, so they're not interrupting your audio. So Christian, birds better than toddlers? Yes, I would say, I think the sound of birds better than toddlers, but toddlers coming into your Zoom is better than some, potentially, seeing some birds. Do I have any written documents to share that give tips on how to annotate altmetric scores or media pickups in your CV? I do not have any written documents. It's just something I've done on the fly. So I have my CV as an example, but that's about it. Okay, so Christian has responded to Jean. Podcast content, make a plan with a few key messages you want to get across, plan the questions, ask the interviewer to ask questions around them. So, okay, so that's a good point. When I am interviewed for podcasts or when I participate in podcasts, I do make a plan about what are the types of things that we're going to cover, or I vet the questions beforehand, and I redirect it to the messaging that I want. And then Christian's giving good advice on actual recording using quality recording devices, ensure no background noises, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, great. All right, well, just one final question from me, Tahina. You talked about potentially some bad science on Twitter. So what do you think that we can do to try to prevent that or discourage it? Because, yeah, sometimes it's the sexy stuff or the, you know, controversial but not so high quality that really gets a lot of pings.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, it would be the same strategy that you use when you're at a conference and something's just been presented that's not great. You know, you want to be constructive and respectful and have civil discourse. And so, you know, I think it's, I don't have a good answer to that other than I try to put in my comment and see if that holds. But certainly there are a lot of people who, you know, put things out there and not necessarily that it's bad, but not precise, not great, but they've got so many followers and people think that what they're saying is accurate. And so I think it's kind of a challenging thing and to try to correct that, but also you know, making sure that you don't come across as, you know, being, you know, whatever negative connotation that someone might have, but trying to be, you know, constructive in whatever comments that you provide.
Yeah, great. All right, well, in the interest of time, we'll move on to Elena now. Thank you, Tahina. So we'll have our third speaker now, Professor Elena Losina. And Elena is a Robert W. Lovett Professor of Orthopedic Surgery, Biostatistics at Harvard Medical School. She's internationally recognized for expertise in melding rigorous clinical research methodologies across multiple clinical disciplines, from orthopedics and osteoarthritis to global health. Elena's actually featured recently on the Joint Action podcast, which is a podcast hosted by Professor David Hunter. So for those who are interested in hearing a podcast and what how it's sort of run, and that would be a really good one to start following, the Joint Action podcast. And in that podcast, Elena was talking about how much does a knee replacement cost an individual in the economy. So I'll hand it over now to you, Elena, and we're looking forward to your talk. Just make sure you're not muted. You're muted, Elena, still.
Okay, now I'm unmuted, and I would imagine that you can see my slides, so you can see my slides and the notes.
Yep, and we can hear you.
Okay, terrific. So thank you so much for inviting me, and there is a kind of benefit of going last because, you know, I probably can go and kind of provide a few more details on stuff that both Tahina and Chris mentioned. So I titled kind of my short talk, Speaking to the Media Do's and Don'ts, and I will talk primarily about the kind of streamlined media journalism and how can we engage them. So how do journalists find about your work? So most of the time it's, as Tahina mentioned, through press releases. And how do press releases getting out there? There are three ways that I'm aware of that press releases are being made. If you give a talk on annual meeting, then potentially annual meeting can come up with a press release. If you're publishing work in a journal and journal feels that it's newsworthy paper, they can issue a press release, and your organization where you're working at. And so at annual meeting, how does the abstract get to this newsworthy status? I think reviewers often are asked to nominate newsworthy abstracts. Then there is a public relations committee that reviews all reviewers' recommendations and make their own recommendations and puts a few abstracts for press releases. And for example, ACR office, American College of Rheumatology, would work with you to put a press release out. If it's a scientific journal, every scientific journal has their own public relations office. And again, based on recommendations from the editors, they select a few articles that they feel that would be very attractive to media for the press releases. And those press releases from scientific journals, usually the higher the impact factor, they get a high likelihood of getting the high visibility is very high. And the third one is organization, your university, your hospital where you work at. And that's the driving force should be you. As Tahina mentioned, that it would be you who would kind of reach out to the PR office and say, I have a paper coming out, and ask for advice, what's from their point of view, what's the likelihood that the media would be interested in covering it, and whether the PR office would work with you to do a press release. And that's where we need to figure out like whose job is it. One way to say this is the PR's office, so I'm going to send them the draft of my paper and they can put the press release together. I usually take a much active role, so I work with the PR office because nobody knows better the gist of the work that I have done than myself. And so we need to recognize that the goal of the press release is to attract attention, and we need to summarize key finding and to widen the dissemination audience. And as with many things we do, like writing a paper, there is what I call a formula. If you know the structure of what you're writing, the writing a paper, it's not as intimidating to sit in front of the white page. I think the same thing goes for press releases. Nobody, probably from anybody who is sitting in this virtual room had been taking a class in the undergraduate or graduate education how to write a press release unless you were in communication major. But I think these are the skills that are very, very useful, and there is a lot of things that I learned as I went through the process. So I just would like to, offer you the recipe for my formula. Again, take a leave. And once you think that press release is a kind of 7 paragraphs and they're short paragraphs, they're very straightforward to put together. Nothing is easy, but they definitely the formula makes it more straightforward. So the first paragraph is usually the main message. So it's similar to a tweet. So if you would like to tweet about your work, what would you want to say? If you have only 2 sentences, how would you summarize it? So that usually goes as the first initial paragraph, and that's what most reporters, making the determination whether to move forward with it or pass. The second paragraph is just general information about disease condition, overall burden, why is it important. The third paragraph is again in a lay language, what was done. And the fourth paragraph is very important. So usually it's a quote. And if you're a lead author or a senior author, then it's a quote from you. And usually the press release contains at least 2 quotes, one from the senior author and one from the lead author, but also you can engage and invite any other author that you think would be providing a useful quote. Again, there are 2 ways you can do it. You can either reach out to a person and say, I'm putting the press release together, working on a press release, please come up with a quote. Or you can say, I drafted something and do you feel comfortable with this quote, or please edit it away. And from my point of view, it's much more proactive but also more efficient approach. The seventh paragraph is very important. It's funding acknowledgement. As much as we kind of like to be recognized for the work that we do, our funders and our institutions also, it's important for them to being recognized, especially if it's a media source, with wide dissemination. I remember many years ago when, one of my papers was kind of noted in New York Times, I received an email from the dean of my school said, nothing can be better than when you wake up on Saturday morning, open the New York Times and see Boston University School of Public Health. At that time, I was in that institution mentioned in New York Times. So that's when I recognized that it's not only kind of very important from my point of view as a researcher, but for the institution, getting a recognition is very important. So please, when you are talking to journalists or in any other way, try to make sure that you acknowledge your funding agency and you acknowledge your institution. And in some ways, that's even more important because many of us have dual appointments or multiple appointments, and often journalists would say we're only going to put your one appointment, and make sure that you're upfront about it, because the one that they choose may not be the one that you have a primary affiliation with, and that may be problematic or causing some hurt feelings. Believe it or not, institutions do have hurt feelings as well. And again, who writes the press release, whose job it is? You can kind of ping and pong it. Usually initial draft is done by PR office, but again, I often do very heavy editing and I don't kind of count whose job it is, because from my point of view, what is important to make sure that the message will come out very clearly. And so this is, this is not for read, but I just would like to say the press release itself, it's not a long document. It's not a 3,500 word papers. It's pretty much a page and a half. And it has the media contact, and it has a title, and then a few key points that I just mentioned. So what is next? So the press release is out. And usually public relations office is publishing its on special list service, and Eureka Alert is one of those. And journalists know very well about those list services servers, and so they are on a constant lookout and see if this is the area that they would be interested. So they basically search PR list, I would probably daily, or definitely when the major medical journals are coming out. And if the press releases of interest, journalists should contact PR office that issued press release. This is very important. This is the etiquette. So usually you would like to maintain all your major communication with the journalists through your PR office. It doesn't mean that you cannot do anything without them, but again, it's a good behavior if you let them know of things that are happening or any invitations that you received. And PR office usually arranges the interview. So when you were invited to interviews, again, I kind of tried to put together do's and don'ts based on my experience, and we're going to start with don'ts because that's very important. So don't expect that all you said will be covered. You may be interviewed for 15 minutes, but as a result, only 30 seconds of what you said would be aired on radio, on TV, or only about a third of what you said will be displayed in actual work. So don't expect that you will be given a chance to proofread or edit. Again, you always should ask, and often journalists do give you a courtesy of fact checking, as they call it, and I always ask for it. But because they have very tight deadlines, sometimes it's just not possible for them to do this, or this is only maybe related to my next point. Don't expect that you will be the only researcher interviewed. Often journalists putting together a larger kind of a piece, and they interviewed several people, and not everybody may agree with you. So I think, and you have no idea who else is being interviewed in the same piece until you see it in the paper. And don't expect that journalists will always present your finding in an objective manner, because sometimes the journalist or their family member also had this condition and they may had bad experience, a good experience, and so obviously they provide an opinion. They're trying to cover facts, but they definitely provide opinions. And so that's why it's important to recognize that sometimes the objectivity that you hope that would shine through the work may not shine. I think, if you have those expectations right, so you don't get really surprised in a bad manner. In fact, don't forget that journalists in many ways, especially in the era of the electronic media and actual mainstream media, they do work for clicks. So they're trying to create titles that would generate those clicks. I remember many years ago, I woke up and I gave an interview in the evening, and I woke up when the first page of USA Today had kind of big title saying 4 million Americans having a fake knee. As you can imagine, I never ever mentioned fake knees in my interview, and I was talking about knee replacement, but that's what the title said. And it was sort of disappointing, but that was probably the title that drew a lot of attention. So don't forget, so they do kind of want to generate clicks. And now in terms of do's, so do's are more straightforward. Do ask for questions up front. I find it always helpful to understand what the journalist is interested in and kind of have time to put my thoughts together and to prepare. Be prepared for a tight timeline. It's not that they kind of left it until the last moment. It's because they could have been asked to cover this piece, or deciding to cover that piece, or giving the permission to cover that topic in a very tight timeline. Again, ask for fast checking post interview, just to make sure that you have an opportunity to provide input. And always be polite. Journalists may put you on the expert list and reach out for commenting on similar topics, and you may have the relationship that is lasting for a long time. Again, make sure that to acknowledge funders and home organizations. I think I can't emphasize it enough. It's very important. And be prepared to be disappointed again. Not all you said will be covered. Your words may be taken out of content. Your conclusions may be overstated. But again, the better you prepare, and sometimes I actually ask for questions up front and provide written answers, and all of this helps to make sure that the journalist will get the story right. I agree with Tehina, they absolutely want to get the story right. And sometimes the topic is just too complicated, or we're just speaking the language that is too jargony. So it's important to make sure that we bring it to the very simple, clear language that people who don't get the MD, MPH, PhD can understand. And again, a few points about techniques for different media forums. So TV, radio, recording versus live. I think most of the interviews are being recorded, and recordings usually heavily edited. Again, sometimes you may talk for 15 minutes, but only, as I said, 30 seconds will be aired. If interviewer asking a question, the same question multiple times, that means that the journalist is not satisfied with the answer that you're giving. So try to come up with the thought from somewhat different angle. And again, avoid jargon, prepare to use language and to deliver the take-home message that you think is important. And avoid heavy use of numbers. I think we know that we convey information or results of the studies very heavily in percentages, in relative risks, in odds ratios, in hazard ratios, but this is not the language that people speak on a daily basis, and therefore it's important to make sure that we take some time to try to dial it down to kind of the language that people speak in restaurants and talking over the dinner table, so they would understand and come kind of what we're talking about. I think a lot had been said about Twitter and Facebook. I'm kind of not a big expert, but following and trying to get feet wet, and and I think follow and be followed. I think this is something that I've been taught, and I think I find Twitter a wonderful opportunity to see interesting research of my colleagues, and very glad to promote their research, and sometimes with a comment or without point. And don't be shy to promote your own research, but again, help it with putting one single tweet, short and concise, what the research is about. With respect to the Facebook, if you have a Facebook, kind of research related Facebook, or the website, keep the content active, stay relevant, and make sure that you have lay summary of the research that we do. In our website, we do provide lay summary for pretty much every paper that we're working on. And podcasts, I think, is evolving new way to disseminate or promote your work, and it has been a great pleasure to give a podcast or being interviewed by David Hunter. I think it's a new way, and we're all learning, and I think David is doing tremendous amount of work to prepare, and I think if you prepare well, that I think the product is coming out very nice. As you can see, I'm emphasizing the same thing that we talked about: infographic, video abstracts, and the new, I think, way to disseminate the work is the pre-publishing med-RVX. And again, I'm still learning about it, but in a COVID era, there is a lot of attention had been given to this repository, and a lot of media attention had been given to this repository. I think we need to recognize that this is preliminary communication, and not every paper that had been deposited to med-RVX had been published. But if you think that your report or research is very, very important and timely, that is a way to see how, put it out earlier than peer reviewed, and then it's being picked up by media quite a bit, and I think it's really counted in the alt metric. And this is, I would like to finish, and again, I think it's very interesting that all three of us at least mentioned the alt metric one way or another. So this is, if 10 years ago most of our productivity had been quantified by the citations, so now I think it's a different world. And in addition to citations, which obviously have a lag time, there is alt metric, which really captures immediate impact, or the recognition or mention of the work or research that you're doing. And so the altmetrics, again, very cleverly does have the information and stratifies by news outlets, by blog, by tweets, by number of Facebook pages, and citations. And I think it also provides very good mapping, so you see at which parts of the world your work is being seen, and it has different tabs that you can see and to understand where and how the work had been picked up by which news medias. We also need to recognize that if researchers would be basically taking work and trying to publish in multiple journals, that would be really perceived very badly. It would be called plagiarism or multiple publishing, and we all attest that the work that we're publishing in one journal has not been published everywhere else or anywhere else. In the news realm and in journalism realm, I think it's not unusual that if one journalist will put a piece about your work, that you will see it in multiple kind of news servers. And I was always surprised to this, but this is how the model works. So one person who writes a piece, I think, also being recognized by the number of different outlets that kind of picks and promotes the same piece. So this is not plagiarism, but that's the model. So that, I think, what I wanted to share with you, and saying, if you would like your work to be disseminated, take action, be proactive, work on press releases, and try to not be afraid or hesitant to get out there. Nobody has been born to talk to journalists. We all learn it, and I think this is how you do it. This is how you do it in medicine. You see one, you do one, and you teach one. So I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Elena. That was a great overview of what we need to do if we want to get out there. And I think I really liked your point about how you just need to play such an active role in your media releases as well. We tend to think that our job is the science and our job is the grants and the papers, but I think you highlighted well that it goes much broader than that, and we have to play quite an active role. There is a question about what steps researchers should take if your study findings have been misreported in the media.
That is, again, that is a very, very good question. Again, remember, this is a media. You probably will sleep on it. It's not a scientific publication. Nobody is going to change clinical practice based on what has been reported or misreported in New York Times. That's going to hurt. I don't think that you can call the journalist and say, I'm disappointed with them or don't agree. But from my experience, and again, I didn't have too many experiences like this, but there were situations where, as I said, fake news or some of the quotes that I've been putting out there and description had not been interpreted exactly the way that I hoped that it would be. And I think from that point of view, you just basically take a deep breath and say, bad experience and move on. I don't think people reading New York Times for more than one day, they read newspaper and they throw it away. Yes, kind of in the internet, it probably will stay, but it's unlikely that it will have a huge impact on your life. It's much more important to make sure that the papers that we're publishing do not have a wrong information, because I think even that you can fix, and it's more important you either put errata or in a worse situations you withdraw the paper. But for the media, you take a deep breath and you move on.
Yeah, that's good advice. There was some discussion from Christian and Tahina about using patients in media releases or getting quotes from patients. Do you have anything?
Yes, journalists often do ask for patient experience, and I think this is it's a little bit of a gray area. So one way of dealing with it, especially if you're a physician, so to talk to a few of your patients and ask whether they would be willing to speak with reporters. But I think we just need to be careful because of the HIPAA regulation. It needs to be clearly patient. The patient should be willing. For some of us who are not MDs, so it's a little more challenging. So what I usually do if the journalist is asking for patient's quote, I usually talk to my colleagues who are physician and talk to PR office, because in PR office in the hospitals, they often have a list of patients who would be interested and willing to speak with journalists. And I think basically what I learned, I skin my knees enough to learn that, anything you do with the journalist, you engage your PR office, because most of the time they're helpful.
Yeah, right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we might go now to our breakout rooms. So I'm going to split us into 3 different groups and have Christian, Tahina, and Elena in the separate groups. So when we're in our breakout rooms, feel free to unmute yourself and you can put your camera on, and we'd like to use it as an opportunity for people to share some of their own experiences, but also as an opportunity to ask some more questions as well if you'd like. So bear with me here while I put us in our rooms.
I don't. Shall I stop recording at this point as well?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Thank you.